Okay, let's dive right into this explainer, where we're going to objectively map out the strategic, financial, and logistical realities of a NATO alliance operating without the United States. For decades, the mere suggestion of America leaving NATO was treated as just unthinkable political theater, totally off the table. But recently, with shifting domestic priorities in Washington and mounting global crises, this has moved from a theoretical thought experiment to a very real contingency plan being modeled in defense ministries all over the world. So today, we're putting the politics completely aside. We're going to look strictly at the data, the hardware, and the raw logistics of what actually happens if the linchpin of the alliance is pulled. Here's our roadmap for today. We'll start with number 1, a fractured alliance. Then 2, Europe's historic rearmament. 3, the combat capability gap. 4, the nuclear umbrella shifts. 5, what America actually loses. And finally, 6, the 2027 danger zone.
So let's kick things off with Section 1, a fractured alliance.
We hear a lot of political rhetoric calling NATO a paper tiger, right? But beyond the talk, actual logistical fractures are literally already happening on the ground. When the United States sought to project power or resupply allies recently, it ran into unprecedented roadblocks from its own treaty partners. Spain outright closed its airspace to U.S. planes, which forces this incredibly complex and costly rerouting. Italy actually blocked U.S. bombers from landing at their critical base in Sigonella. And France, they banned U.S. resupply flights destined for Israel. These aren't just minor diplomatic spats happening behind closed doors. These are physical blockades affecting real-world military operations. Historically, sure, NATO allies might have grumbled a bit, but they ultimately facilitated American logistics. Now they're actively obstructing them. That signals a profound shift in alliance cohesion. So if the U.S. actually decides to walk away, it's leaving a framework that is arguably more disjointed right now than at any point since the Cold War.
Moving on to Section 2. Europe's historic rearmament.
Let's look at the numbers because this is wild. In 2025, European NATO members hit a record $600 billion in defense spending. That represents a nearly 13% increase in real terms from just the year prior. Now, to really grasp the gravity of that number, you have to remember that for the last 20 years, European defense budgets were pretty much defined by stagnation and deep cuts. After the Cold War ended, a lot of nations just cashed in on what we call the peace dividend. They let their militaries sort of atrophy while relying heavily on the U.S. security umbrella. So hitting $600 billion, that is a massive structural reversal of that trend. The money is undeniably beginning to flow, and it marks a real turning point in continental security. And this historic shift proves that the old, long-standing complaints about European burden sharing, well, they're actively being resolved. Just look at Germany. Their defense budget jumped to $107 billion in a single year. That's a profound cultural and political pivot for a country that is essentially stuck to constitutional pacifism for 8 decades. And then you have Poland, spending nearly 5% of its GDP on defense, quietly building up what has become one of the most heavily armed and modernized land forces on the entire continent. But the momentum doesn't stop there. The agreed target from the 2025 Hague Summit is a massive 5% of GDP across the board by 2035. If they actually hit that target alliance-wide, European defense spending could reach $850 billion by 2030. That's roughly where the massive U.S. baseline sits today. The financial shift is very, very real, and Europe is putting serious capital behind its defense. But money isn't everything, which brings us to Section 3, the combat capability gap. On paper, European NATO members currently field roughly 2.1 million active troops. And honestly, that sounds incredibly formidable. France, Germany, the UK, Poland, Italy, they each have well over 100,000 active personnel ready to go. To put that into perspective for you, the active duty United States military hovers right around 1.3 million personnel, and Russia's active force is roughly 1.3 to 1.5 million. So strictly by the headcount, Europe possesses a significantly larger standing military than either of the world's primary superpowers. On paper, it looks like an absolute unstoppable defensive wall. But here's the catch. In practice, Europe is completely missing the fundamental logistical backbone and the interoperable systems that the U.S. military has been providing for 30 years.
Europe operates this huge, chaotic variety of non-interoperable weapon systems across its borders. We're talking different tanks requiring entirely different parts, varying calibers of artillery. It makes joint operations incredibly messy and turns supply chains into an absolute nightmare. Plus, they are genuinely short on the very things that make modern warfare function on a grand scale. Strategic airlift to move large forces quickly, air-to-air refueling tankers to keep jets in the sky, and deep strike capabilities to neutralize distant threats. And perhaps most dangerously, NATO's entire command structure currently relies almost entirely on US-owned intelligence networks, targeting data, and satellite communications. Without that American backbone acting as the nervous system for the alliance, those 2.1 million troops simply cannot fight as a unified, cohesive army.
Which brings us to the ultimate deterrent in Section 4. The nuclear umbrella shifts. For 77 years, Europe's security rested on one ultimate guarantee. Attacking a NATO member meant risking all-out nuclear war with America. But with that American nuclear guarantee potentially leaving the chat, Europe isn't just standing still. France and the UK have actually begun formalizing joint submarine patrols to ensure continuous at-sea deterrence. Even bigger, to counter the potential American vacuum, French President Emmanuel Macron announced an initiative called Forward Deterrence in March 2026. This formally extends France's nuclear umbrella over Germany, Belgium, and Poland. Guys, this is a monumental geopolitical shift. A formally declared European nuclear deterrent covering multiple non-nuclear states that didn't even exist a year prior to this announcement.
But applying the cold, hard logic of deterrence, we have to ask ourselves a really tough objective question. Would a French president actually risk Paris getting hit by an intercontinental ballistic missile just to protect Warsaw? It's a vastly different geopolitical calculus than Washington's historical stance. Think about it. During the Cold War, the U.S. stationed hundreds of thousands of troops in Germany. That virtually guaranteed that any Soviet attack would immediately spill American blood and trigger a massive response. France just doesn't have that same tripwire force spread across Eastern Europe. A European nuclear umbrella is certainly better than nothing, absolutely. But whether adversaries truly believe France would trade its own survival for its neighbors? Well, that is a much, much harder question to answer.
Now, let's flip the script. Section 5, what America actually loses. We have to realize Europe isn't just some one-way defensive obligation. It provides the vital physical infrastructure and intelligence networks that make the U.S. military functional on a global scale. Take Ramstein Air Base in Germany. It's not just there to defend Berlin. It actively coordinates critical drone operations across the Middle East against Iranian proxies, and it manages essential satellite relays that keep U.S. forces connected worldwide. Then there's Aviano Air Base in Italy. That's the only U.S. fighter base south of the Alps, which allows for rapid, uninterrupted force projection right into the Mediterranean and North Africa. Meanwhile, Naval Station Rota in Spain handles highly advanced ballistic missile defense for the entire Atlantic theater and serves as a major marine staging ground. And beyond all these physical bases, deeply integrated European human and signal intelligence networks give the United States its vital picture of counterterrorism operations across Africa, not to mention tracking naval movements in the deep Atlantic. America relies heavily on this real estate. In fact, as retired military officials have plainly stated on the record, losing these bases drops America from a global superpower to a regional one. Abandoning this European infrastructure isn't just some political talking point or a simple budget cut. It fundamentally degrades America's ability to operate anywhere else on the planet. Without these logistical hubs, U.S. global operations become significantly slower, drastically more expensive, and in some rapid response scenarios, nearly impossible to execute effectively. And that leads us to our final point, Section 6, the 2027 Danger Zone. This is where we unpack the terrifying timeline mismatch between Europe's long-term defense goals and their immediate looming threats. When you plot these dates out visually, it perfectly maps the danger gap facing the continent. The U.S. is already beginning to step back. In early 2026, command of major NATO hubs in Naples and Norfolk was officially handed over to European officers. Now, by 2030, European defense spending is projected to finally reach that staggering $850 billion mark. And by 2035, the Hague Summit deadline requires all member states to hit their 5% GDP defense targets, ensuring a fully funded, independent military apparatus. Okay, sounds great, right? But multiple intelligence assessments point to 2027 as the year a primary adversary could be ready to directly test NATO's eastern flank. So, to credibly deter that specific threat in 2027, Europe would need an immediate $270 billion annually and 300,000 additional combat-ready troops right now, not a decade from now.
And this gap matters globally because allies in the Pacific, we're talking Japan, South Korea, and the Philippines, they are watching this dynamic extremely closely. When Pacific allies see the United States potentially walk away from 31 established democracies in Europe, they immediately start calculating their own survival odds. They quietly begin building the capacity to operate without American support. Japan is already proactively deploying independent long-range strike capabilities to its southwestern islands, fundamentally altering its post-war defense posture. The ripple effect of a U.S. exit from Europe absolutely does not stay in Europe. It immediately alters security commitments, defense spending, and geopolitical stability worldwide. So to conclude our explainer today, we want to leave you with this final, critical thought. Will Europe's 2035 readiness arrive too late for a 2027 threat? The bottom line here is that a fully independent European defense might be entirely viable eventually, especially given the sheer economic weight of the continent and their current financial trajectory. But a NATO operating without the United States is substantially weaker and more vulnerable right now. The capabilities they need take years to build, but the geopolitical threats are accelerating today. Will Europe survive the gap when they are most exposed? Thank you so much for exploring the data and the logistics with us today. Keep asking the tough questions, and we'll see you in the next explainer.